Hi, it's Rhythmman. Today I'm going to do a comprehensive overview on the Steam controller. I've done videos on the Steam controller in the past, but I felt like I've always missed maybe small details here and there, and it wasn't quite as comprehensive as I wanted it to be. So today I'm going to try to do just a overview over everything that you need to know to get started with the Steam controller, just so that everybody can be on the same place when it comes to the basics. So let's go ahead and get started. In order to use the Steam controllers, you really only need two things: an actual Steam controller and the wireless dongle, and you're also going to need Steam, the software. If you play games on the PC, you probably already have Steam. If you don't, I suggest you try it out. You can get a lot of games on it pretty easy, a lot of which are free. So Steam is going to insist that you run everything through big picture mode. The controller was designed with on the couch play in mind. So if you're on the couch, big picture mode will be best, but if you're just sitting at a desk, like most PC users I think, you're probably going to want to avoid big picture mode. And I'm going to show you ways to use the controller without big picture mode, but it's best to get started at least setting things up in big picture mode so that you can get basically a general understanding of how things work. By the time you're done with the setup, you'll have named your controller. I named mine Rhythmman's controller. You'll also be able to change things like how bright the button on the controller is or what sounds it makes when you turn the controller on. I have it at default sound because it's the least annoying in my opinion, but you could have it make whatever sound you want. There's a list of different sounds that you can have it make, so go crazy there. One thing you might have noticed too in settings is that you can customize the base configurations. So we'll get into configurations and details a little bit later. But basically from here, you can choose what the buttons do when you're on a desktop. You can choose what the buttons do when you're in big picture mode, like this screen right here. And you can also choose what the buttons do with the Steam button cord, which is basically, if we open this up, so for example, you see how this here says Y is to turn off. So if I hold down the Steam button in the middle and press Y, that turns off the controller. If I hold the Steam button in the middle and press up on the stick, that raises the volume or moves to the next track. So those are just little things that you could do. You're probably not gonna do much except for turn off the controller and take screenshots, which is the Steam button plus the right bumper button. And you could obviously, I'll show you later, but you can obviously set that to whatever you want it to be. One other thing that you might be interested in is choosing your on-screen keyboard. So the Steam controller allows you to type using the pads on the controller. I'm using the standard on-screen keyboard because that seems quickest to me. I'll show you what that looks like. But you can also use a daisy wheel on-screen keyboard, which I personally don't use. But if you want to experiment with different types of keyboards, I suggest you give it a try if you're into configurations. But if you don't care about that kind of thing, you could just leave it at default. When it comes to using the controller, I think most people can agree that the default configurations for most games are pretty terrible. Where the Steam controller shines is in its ability to be configured. You can configure the Steam controller to work almost any way you want. In order to do that, there's a couple of different ways. From big picture mode, you go to your library, you select the game you want to play. I'll use Warframe as an example, and you move down to manage games and controller configurations. From there, you can choose the configurations you want for the game. If this screen freaks you out, don't be too alarmed. It freaked me out when I first started using the controller too. But after a while you get used to it. Once you realize what everything does, you're going to be pretty comfortable with this screen because you're going to want to use it for every game you play. Sometimes you might want to use it multiple times for different modes. But if you're smart, you'll be able to find a controller scheme that works out pretty well no matter what you're doing in the game. Also, one thing that you should know is that the Steam is able to remember your controllers. So if you're using more than one controller, remember how I showed you how I named my controller? if you have multiple controllers with different names, it will remember each controller separately and remember how each controller is configured. So that's very helpful. I've seen a lot of Steam review videos on YouTube, and a lot of them talk about how clunky or odd the controller feels. And I will admit it's really different, but I don't think it's different in a bad way. There are a lot of advantages to using the Steam controller, so I'll just show you a few. First off is the dual stage trigger on both the left and right trigger. As you can see, when I go to my trigger, my left trigger can be used to aim, but it can also be used to use one of my Warframe's powers. The way I do that is if I softly pull it, it will just aim the weapon, but if I pull it all the way, it's going to use the power. And you'll know when it's pulled all the way because the controller makes a sort of click sound. There's actually a little bit of resistance and a click when you make a full press. In order to get that working, you need to use hip fire mode. There's normal, relaxed, and aggressive hip fire mode. And basically, hip fire mode, all of them basically make it so that you can basically separate the two actions. Whereas, let's say if you use simple threshold, it doesn't necessarily separate it out. If I use simple threshold, even if I just want to use a power, I'm going to end up aiming down the sights because those two are bound to the same trigger. Whereas with hip fire mode, if I quickly pull the trigger all the way to the click, then it won't aim, it'll just straight use the power. But if I slowly do it, it will instead aim. With aggressive being the one where there's a short delay time between the two, with relaxed being a long delay time. So because I need to be able to aim quickly, I use aggressive, and it's almost instantaneous between when I pull the trigger and when it aims down the sight. There's a very slight delay, but it's not big enough to make a difference when I'm gaming. It's big enough for me to make a difference when I just want to use powers only. Another thing that's unique to the Steam controller are the back grip buttons. They're on the back of the controller. You can't see it in this diagram, but you can feel them on your middle or fourth finger behind the controller as you're gripping the controller. And this is very useful in situations where you want to maybe jump or roll or something like that, but you don't want to take your thumb off of the joystick, or in this case the mouse pad. I see some Pro controllers using this, like the Xbox Pro controller uses this. It actually has 2 grip buttons, which is very nice. But I find that, you know, if you do things right, you really only need just 2 grip buttons. Although I have to admit, I would have really liked to have an extra grip button. That would have blew the Xbox Pro controller out of the water. You can bind those bindings just like you can with any of the other keys. Once you click on it, you can select which key you want to, what action you want it to do. And if you press the Y button and toggle on multi-button, you can choose to have a button do multiple things instead of just one thing. I can make it move my arc wing up, and I can make it, you know, use my gear 8 hotkey. And actually, I think I've already I have it set up to jump. So normally I would jump, but if I'm in the arc wing, then it'll have it fly upward instead. So that's an example of a multi-button right there. And I'm doing on the opposite side, I have it to crouch, slide, and roll, or move down the arc wing. And because the two happen in different contexts, it actually works out very smoothly and very well. The most controversial part about the Steam controller, however, is the trackpad. Some people hate it and some people love it. One thing I'll admit is when I first tried it, it was hard to get used to. If you're used to a regular controller, then having this instead of a thumbstick is very disorienting. And if I had things my way, I actually probably would have vouched to have both a trackpad and the joystick. Maybe some way to switch the two out, or maybe find a way to fit both of them on a controller and just use whichever one you want. But in the Steam controller's defense, if you're doing a lot of games like that involve a mouse or that involve aiming a gun down a sight, the trackpad actually gives you just a little bit more fine control, albeit you have to get used to it. Generally, trackpads are a little more accurate than joysticks when it comes to that kind of thing. Unless, of course, you've had years of experience with a joystick, in which case you're going to have to practice and get years of experience with the trackpad again. I think it's worth it? It depends on what kind of gamer you are. Lastly, and possibly an even more controversial feature, is the gyroscope. And a lot of people I noticed have made comments on my videos like, how do you, well, not a lot of people, a couple people have been wondering, how do you get the gyroscope to work? Where's the gyroscope setting? And as you can see, I'm highlighting different buttons. It's right underneath the controller with this little gyro symbol. That's where the gyroscope is. So if you click there, normally I have it set to mouse input, but obviously you can set it to any of these different types of inputs depending on what your needs are for that game. If you're driving, you know, you might want to set it to joystick, for example, for a driving game. That way you can steer the controller like a steering wheel. So that's where the gyroscope is. Use it if you want to, don't if you don't. Most people really hate gyroscope and would prefer to have nothing to do with it, but I actually find that the gyroscope gives me a lot more precision once I, you know, practice with it. I can aim and do things like that way better with the gyroscope. So again, to each his own. The high point of the controller is its customizability, so it's there if you want to use it, and just don't use it if you don't want to use it. So one thing that I think everybody should know is that even though the Steam controller sort of pushes you towards big picture mode and sort of emphasizes big picture mode, you by no means have to use big picture mode to use the Steam controller. Even if you take it off big picture mode, the Steam controller will still work, and you don't even need to go to big picture mode in order to configure the controller. What I found is that if the Steam controller is on, now remember the Steam controller has to actually be on. If it's off, this won't work. If you right click on the game you want to configure, and you see here, edit Steam controller configurations, it brings up a pop-up window where you can basically configure everything from there. So if you don't feel like going through the whole, you know, big picture, because it's kind of clumsy. If you're on the computer and you have a mouse, this is much quicker. You can just open it up and you can change things to whatever you want. At the time of this video, it's slightly buggy. I notice sometimes, you know, once in the blue moon, it might force close on me. But most of my settings are saved, so I just open it back up and then just configure things. And this even works while I'm in the middle of the game. If I just alt tab to minimize the game, go right in here, configure things, maximize the game up again, boom, my configuration is transferred over. So if you're not into big picture mode, don't feel obligated. Just, you know, right click right there. Did you notice that when I press on a button to configure, that it actually shows a list of available actions that I can assign that to? That's because Warframe, like a couple of other games, are actually designed with the Steam controller in mind. So I can directly change actions on the Steam controller instead of assigning each button to a key on the keyboard. Also, did you notice at the top there are a bunch of different tabs, like a launcher, game, melee mode, menu. Some games, like Warframe, another good example why I chose that game as an example, that are designed for the Steam controller, have different actions based on the context that you're in. So let's take this for example. If I'm just in the normal game, doing normal gameplay, normal gunplay, these are the bindings, these are what each button does. But if I'm in a different mode, if I have my sword pulled out, because when you have your sword out, there's no point in having a button for shoot, but there is a purpose in having a button for attack. I can change things accordingly. So my bindings for when my sword is out is different than my bindings for when my gun is out, and they're way different than my bindings for when I'm in the menu. And so some games can have many of them. Actually, of all games I played, Warframe has had the most, because there's just a lot going on in Warframe. Warframe is a very complicated game, and despite that complexity, the Steam controller works very well for it. Not all games automatically have different tabs or action sets depending on different actions. Some games you have to make action sets for yourself, and it's really pretty easy. At the top of the screen, there's the button here that says Add Action Set. Just click on that, and from here you can name the action set whatever you want it to be named, like that. And you can also choose to just have start from a blank slate, or you can copy one of the other action sets and then change it from there. I'm gonna go ahead and cancel that because I don't need a third action set. Once you have more than one action set up, if you press the select button, it'll bring up another menu for the action set that you're currently having highlighted, and you can change the name of this action set. You'll also be able to choose which action sets are automatically switched to depending on certain variables. So in the case of Overwatch, I have it set up so that when the cursor is shown, that's the little mouse, that I'm using the menu action sets, because obviously when I'm in a menu, the mouse is going to be available, and when I'm in game, the mouse is going to be hidden, because that's how games work. So then I'm going to use the game action sets in that case. Works out very well, and even you wouldn't know it, but you would think that Overwatch was actually made with the Steam controller in mind because of how seamlessly it works going between the two. These are my bindings for when I'm playing a game. These are my bindings for when I'm in the menu waiting for another game. When binding buttons for a game that doesn't have native Steam controller support, you're going to have to do things manually, but it still works out. For instance, I want the X button to be the reload button, which is R, and to help make things look clean on the big screen, I can also select a name for it right there at the top. I put reload there. So what happens when I choose R, you gotta go here. Yes, so when you click that, when you choose R, it ends up showing up like this, where each button basically has which key is being pressed, but also because I named everything, I can see very clearly what keys do what. And that's very important if you just bound everything for a game and you kind of forgot, oh yeah, what does this button do again? It's much easier to look at it this way. Some games are pretty simple and you have enough buttons on the controller to assign a button for every action. But some games, there are too many actions for there to be enough buttons to place everything on. In those cases, you want to use something called Activators. So I can show you what an activator is now. Let's use this X button as an example. Let's say I want the X button to be my context action, which is also a reload button. But I also want it to be the reverse camera button. Now obviously if I just use multi-button, every time I press X to reload, it's also going to reverse the camera. I can't have that. What I can do is add an activator. So when you press select, it brings you to this screen and shows you your activators. Right now I just have a regular press activation type activator on for the context action. But if I add an activator, now I have two activators. Both of them are regular press. So if I regular press, I'll not only do context action, but I'll also do reverse camera. That's still the same problem as before. I want to change things so that I can choose which one I want depending on the circumstance. In order to do that, I'm going to change the activation type to double press. Now if I regular single press the button, I'll reload the gun. But if I double press the button, I'll reverse the camera. And depending on what I need to do, I can add a third activator. Let's say I don't really need to do this, but for the sake of argument, let's say I want to show player list. And I want it to be different than these two. So I'll make that a long press button. So now the long press will cause me to show a player list so I can see all the players, their health. their health and magic points and everything. If I double press, I can reverse the camera, and if I just regular press, I will just reload. And obviously, as you probably noticed, there are other action types too. When I play Street Fighters, and you might call me a cheater for this, but when I play Street Fighters, sometimes I don't feel like doing the combinations to pull off special moves. Sometimes I feel like pressing one button and then pulling off the special move. So what I could do is go to start press, use a start press activation type for this. For, let's say, this is fire weapon, but let's say it was like, you know, down button or something like that. You know, the Hadouken would be down, down right, and then right. So when I press the X button, first, immediately after that, it's going to press down. Then I make another start press activator, and you know, a quarter of a second after that, it's going to do down right. Then I make another activator, and then a quarter of a second after that, it'll be right. Then I make another activator. I don't know if you see what I'm doing here, but basically I created a macro. Okay, if you don't know what macros are, then you don't need to worry about that. This is more advanced than you'll ever need to use. But if you're the kind of person that likes macros and knows how to use them and knows how to make them, you'll be delighted to know that you can do simple macros with the Steam controller by doing stuff like that. Same thing for end delay. Now this would be more useful in start press, because in start press you can't tell it how long. It's just a toggle, or maybe not a toggle. If it's not a toggle, you just say end it, you know, half a second after I press it. Again, if you're into macros, you know what I mean. If you're not, you're probably like, hey, can you hurry up and move to something that I know, you know, that makes sense. Anyway, I think for those of you who are into advanced stuff, I've gone over this enough. I need to erase all of this because all of this is useless in Warframe. This is just example stuff. But I hope you guys get the idea of how important activators can be for advanced users. Those of you who are into advanced settings, you also want to take advantage of this. If you're using the mouse, it's a little different. You could just click on it. But if you're using the Steam controller, you can also press the start button. It'll bring you to advanced settings. From here, you can do more with the controller. Right now, I'm in the ABXY area, as you can see, ABXY. But I'm in advanced settings. So now in advanced settings, even though this is a button pad, I can choose to turn it into a directional pad. And I could go crazy, and instead of making a normal directional pad where each direction is an up, down, you know, left arrow, I can make each direction, you know, a special item here. So, you know, now the difference between direction pad and button pad is that you have the choice to create it with or without an overlay if it's a directional pad, which honestly doesn't mean a whole lot here. It means more here with the trackpad, but you know, for the sake of argument, you know, let's say you want to overlay. That means if you press on the corner, you can activate both left and right, or up and right at the same time. Whereas without overlay, it will just choose whichever one you're closest to and activate that at once. Analog emulation, cross gate, we don't need to go over that in this tutorial. I really never found any use for it. I'm sure there are some games where it can be useful, but I personally have not found any use for it, so I'm going to ignore that. Button pad is on here twice. Just ignore that. You can also, you know, go crazy. You could turn your button pad into a joystick, you know, if you're into that kind of thing, or into a joystick mouse. Okay, I'll go into what that stuff means a little bit later. But basically, you can customize your button pad to do or emulate all sorts of things from this menu. If you are not an advanced user, I would recommend just sticking to the basics, like this. Make the button pad a button pad. That's all you really need. Obviously, when it comes to advanced settings, the same holds true to everything, not just button pads. So you can go to advanced settings. This is the basic settings. You can make advanced settings when it comes to the joystick, and you can bind the outer ring, which is when you press the stick all the way to the outer. You can bind that to a button. So that might be useful in a game where you want binding it all the way to the edge to activate sprint. Right now I have click action activate sprint, but I can make the outer edge activate sprint instead. This is just how I prefer to do it. You can make it, emulate a right joystick instead of a left joystick, or you can make it emulate a mouse. So when I press on the stick, instead of the game receiving gamepad joystick input, it receives mouse input that emulates a thumb pad. So the further out to the edge you press, the more the mouse moves. It moves a little more quickly, and that would be useful for games that don't have support for joystick. You can, instead of make it move, you can make it all sorts of things. You can change it to look, which is, a slightly, different options when it comes to joystick. It's very similar to joystick, but different options. It feels different. If you're an advanced user, you would use that. You can emulate the directional pad, right? So where it's pressing up, press up on the direction pad. That would be useful in games that don't have a joystick, like SNES emulator. You could really bind it to a whole bunch of things. You can make it do a whole bunch of things. And the same is true for both the left trackpad and the right trackpad. They can be bound to all sorts of different things. This is just the basic settings. If I go in advanced, this is the advanced settings actually. Warframe was updated to work with a Steam controller. So instead of actually binding to the keyboard, you can bind to actions. However, if you prefer to just bind to keyboard keys, you can do that by pressing the start button on the Steam controller. This shows up, and you could basically bind to one of the keys. You could bind it to one of the mouse buttons. You could even bind it to one of the gamepad buttons. You can even bind it to this stuff up here to turn off the controller, or you could bind it to click a specific spot on the screen. This is useful for maybe like MOBAs or something like that. I don't use it a whole lot. You could bind screenshots if you want to take a picture of the screen. You could bind, this will open up the keyboard if you want to type something in. Let's say you want to talk to someone in a chat. You could bind a button to do that. So there's a lot of different things that you can bind it to. I suggest that you make sure that you don't forget anything. Make sure that you don't overlook anything, because it's really easy to miss out. Like these buttons here, man, I didn't know these were here until like a good 6 months after I had the controller. And it would have been very helpful to know that they were here. You might think that the Steam controller doesn't have a rumbler, and you might be correct. I don't know if it was an oversight or if they just felt like it wasn't needed. But after hearing outcry, the team decided to emulate what a rumbling would feel like. So if you have a Steam controller, you can click here to use the rumble emulation. And in situations where you would normally feel a rumble in the controller haptic feedback will be set off. Oh my goodness, I haven't talked about haptic feedback. Basically, haptic feedback is when the controller makes a sort of tick or a shake whenever you touch it a certain way. Basically, it gives you a better idea of what's going on inside the controller. So right now I'm under the options for the trackpad on the right side that controls the mouse. And if you see all the way over here on the right, I have haptic intensity set to low, which means that if I, move around my thumb on a trackpad, there's going to be a slight clicking sound. I don't know how to explain it, but when you feel it, you'll know what I mean. It's sort of a clicking, shaking sound, and you can increase the intensity of that if it's not high enough for you. I normally keep it on low or off, but when you want a little feedback for what's happening, put that on, and it kind of feels like there's pieces inside the controller moving. It's really nice. I know it sounds weird, but try it. You have to actually try it to get it. It's one of the things you have to try to get it. I can't explain it to you. Just try it. If you don't like it, turn it off. As you might have been able to guess, I've only just scratched the surface of what the Steam controller can do. If you're the kind of person who likes to tinker around, you can spend the time to find out how exactly you want to set up your trackpad. You can do all sorts of crazy things, but most games I find only really need the options that I've showed you today. I can sit here and talk about the configuration for the entire day, but let's talk about how to get the configurations to work. It's pretty simple. If you're in big picture mode, all you have to do is start your game. Like this. You're gonna get a warning sometimes saying that it wasn't made for a controller. Just ignore that. I don't know what they're talking about. You've already configured your controller. It's gonna work fine. Yeah, just play the game. So let's say you want to run games using the Steam controller, but you don't want to run it in big picture mode. Well, if it comes to just straight up Steam games, you don't need big picture mode. You could just open it from within the desktop like this. Just press play and it will work. And if you want to continue using the Steam overlay, the big picture overlay, you can keep that checkbox marked on. However, because I want to avoid the big picture overlay, I'm going to have it mark off. That way I don't have to deal with any of that fancy business. I could just play my game the way I want to play it. There are disadvantages and advantages to both. If you really want to find out what's best, I suggest that for the game that you want to play, try it with it, try it without it. If you don't notice the difference, well, it probably doesn't matter to you. But for me, I notice a difference and I like it all. So you might be wondering, well, what if I want to play a non-Steam game, but I want to use the Steam controller? How do I do that? Well, it's hard and not hard. The way Steam suggests that you do it is that you go to these games settings right here, click on add a non-Steam game to my library, and look through your list of programs to find the program that's a game. Give it a moment, it's loading. This is what they suggest you doing. As you can see, it's kind of slow, kind of bothersome. You find a game you want, click it, add it to your selected programs, and boom, now Overwatch is a non-Steam game, but it shows up on Steam. I should be able to, use the Steam controller now, right? Just go to edit configurations like before. And yes, that's true, but no, I prefer not to do that because it's just too much. It's just too much. And you can still run into bugs. Sometimes if the computer gets a hiccup, even though you're in the Steam library, it might not detect that Overwatch is a Steam game, and so the configurations don't run through. I have a much better way of approaching this. But first, let me delete this. Delete shortcut. There you go. What I'm about to show you is top secrets. Don't let the people at Valve know. But you can actually hack the system by going to big picture mode just for a moment. Just go to big picture mode, go to settings, go to base configurations, desktop configuration. Desktop configurations are the configurations that your controller has when you're not in a game. So I basically cheat. I make my desktop configurations the Overwatch bindings. That way Steam doesn't have to detect that I'm playing Overwatch for the Overwatch bindings to work. This will work even if I don't add it to the Steam library. I just open up Overwatch and I play. And if I want to, I could, right now Overwatch is the only non-Steam game I really play that much. So it's the only non-Steam game that I make bindings for. But I could make bindings for other games and save those and browse for those later and switch between the two. But this is basically what I did for my Overwatch. So if you just go to the game and open it normally, Steam won't know that you have Overwatch open, so it won't switch to anything else. It'll still keep doing the desktop configurations, and you basically hack the system. You're welcome. After you spent all that time working on your configurations, you might want to actually save it. There isn't necessarily a save button, but you can export the configurations, which is basically as good as saving. There's different ways to export it. You can save as a personal binding. This way only you can see it. If you save, I never really tried the two out because I only have one computer, but my assumption is if you save the new personal bindings, then if you open this up on another computer, you can still use those bindings. Whereas if you save it as a local binding, you will only be able to access it from that computer that you exported it on. Don't know why you would want to do that, but maybe you want to do that. You can if you want to. You can also save it as a community binding. Now, for this says that I've only used this for less than 15 minutes. That's not necessarily true. I've used it for more than that, but since I was messing around with it to show you guys what it's like, now it thinks that it's a brand new configuration. But basically, if you've used your configuration for more than 15 minutes, you can export it to the community and save it so that someone else can load it. If you're really proud of what you've done, I suggest that you do this. It will help someone else out who maybe is not as good as you when it comes to making bindings. You can also save to a template. There are already templates that come with Steam that usually work out the gate. So like in the normal keyboard and mouse game, this usually works because, you know, let's be real, most of the time interact is E, reload is R, you know, up is W, S is back. And you only need to change small things. So that's a template right there. And then, you know, you have the gamepad with camera controls, gamepad with high precision. Those come with Steam. You can make your own template if you think your bindings are that good that they not only work perfectly for the game you made it for, but will work again with other games as well. You can do that. Create another template for you to choose from. And then there's your other games. You can't really save here, but if for some reason I want to make my Borderlands bindings and export them over to my Warframe bindings, I could do that. You don't do that from export though, you do that from load, but these are basically the different types of saves that you have. Now that's if I press Y to export configurations. If I instead want to load a configuration, I press X, and it's warning me that if I do that I'll lose everything. Yeah, I don't care. So from here you can download the recommended configuration, which is Warframe's own configuration. I recommend you start with this. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's a good starting point. Or let's say you just really hate their configurations and you just want to try something else. You would not have personal bindings. I have a lot of bindings. Warframe is the game that I experimented with the controller to try out different things to find out what everything does. It's my test dummy, so before I go on YouTube and show other guys what the buttons do, I test it out on Warframe. So those are all my bindings. You can choose from the community of bindings. These are a list of bindings here. Import. And you can choose from a list of templates. I already talked about templates earlier. You can also choose from your other games. This is what I was talking about earlier comes in. If I wanted to put my Borderlands 2 bindings and use that for my Warframe bindings, I can. The games are nothing alike. It probably won't work. But if you wanted to do it, you can. Now, thank you guys for sticking with me through the video this far. I know there's a lot of stuff here. And now we're going into territory that's slightly not Steam controller. And by that I mean this. I just plugged the PlayStation controller in, and this is a relatively new feature. However, one worth talking about, Steam now has native support for the PlayStation controller, which I'm sure that will get a lot of PS4 fans excited, because if you already have one of these controllers, it basically now has just about the same level of customizability as the Steam controller, which means you don't have to go out and buy a new controller. You can use that same old $64 controller that you already spend your hard-earned cash on. And it really does provide the same amount of, maybe even more customizability as the Steam controller. As you can see, how do I put this? You can basically use this trackpad as to sort of be the analog to the trackpad on the Steam controller. As you see here, I have it set to mouse. What's interesting is you can split this up into two partitions. So right now I have it in two partitions, where this side is one trackpad and this side is another, that I combine to anything like a generic directional pad, or if I go to advanced settings, I combine it to a button pad, to a mouse, to the joystick. I can do a touch menu. I can do a lot of things with it. I'm going to turn that off though. I don't really need that. And you can even swap to a unified pad like this, and basically now it's only one partition. The whole thing is one trackpad, which again you could set to any number of things. It's really nice. I actually like it almost better than the Steam controller. I feel like if maybe I spent more time with this than I did the Steam controller, I might have liked this better, but I'm just more comfortable with the Steam controller. You can bind buttons just like you can on the Steam controller. You have the joysticks here, which I don't know if you remember, but earlier I was saying it would be really nice if the Steam controller had joysticks and a trackpad. The PS4 controller has both, and it has a gyroscope, so you can still, if you like gyroscope, you can still set things with that too. It's really great in that respect. So if you're more comfortable with your old controller, Valve heard you. They've added native support for the PlayStation DualShock 4 controller, and there's a rumor that they're adding support for the Xbox controller pretty soon. In fact, if you want to try that out now, download the Steam client beta and you can try out native support for the Xbox controller. Xbox controller is not as, I would say it's not as robust as a Steam controller or a PlayStation controller. In my imagination, the only thing you can do is change which buttons do what, and maybe add activators. However, it's still nice to have the option to customize the Xbox controller, even if it's not as fleshed out as a PlayStation controller. I mean, it's still, the Xbox controller is still one of my favorite controllers. Anyway, thanks for sticking with me through that whole video. I know it was a lot of information. When it comes to the Steam controller, there's no easy guide, there's no 5-minute video that can tell you everything about it. There's a lot to learn about the Steam controller, and I know that you probably still have some more questions about it. What I want you to do is leave a comment with your questions so that I can try to tackle those questions later. I'm going to try to put more videos up to be detailed like this about the Steam controller, because for example, when it comes to the trackpad, I could put up a whole video just on the trackpad. I mean, that's just how much customizability is in the trackpad alone, let alone like all of the other buttons. So we're gonna try something like that. We're gonna try going over everything in depth so that if you have a Steam controller, you know how to configure it for your games. If you don't have a Steam controller, you have a better idea whether it's something worth buying. And hey, if you want to try it out but you don't know if you want to really spend money on it, as you just saw, PlayStation controller also works too. So you can just start there if you already have that one. Anyway, thanks for watching the video. Leave a thumbs up if you liked it and you found it informative. Leave a thumbs down if you really hate the sound of my voice and wish I would die. And be sure to subscribe so that you'll be the first to know when I put out another video. Thanks. Ciao. Don't forget to browse through my other videos. I have a video showing how I set up my controller for aiming, mouse aiming on the Steam controller. Also, I have a whole playlist a series called Does the Steam Controller Work?, showing you what my impressions are of different games. Here's a spoiler. I think it works for all games.